Thank you ever so much, Pam, for your welcome, and thank you everyone for coming along. I don't know if this is good or bad news, but I'm going to be making you do lots of work here. This is going to be a co-created workshop, and you will have some decisions to make about what you'd like to cover, but we'll come to that in a bit. As Pam said, I'm from Sparks, and oh, hello, Lauren, just coming in there. Good to have you. So I'm from, oh, and Ruth, oh, they are creeping in. So yeah. Hello to those of you who've just joined us. Good to have you. So as Pam said, I'm Simon from Sparks, and I suspect a lot of you will have heard of Sparks, even if you're not based in Scotland, but for the uninitiated, we're basically the National Agency for Student Engagement in Scotland. So we're funded by our funding council to work across the colleges and universities. So we do a lot of work of a tertiary nature. We obviously, of course, work with the students' associations as well, and all our fellow sector agencies to ensure that students are at the heart of the big decisions on quality and shaping of learning institutionally and nationally, as well, as I alluded to slightly in my chat this morning. You can find out more on our website. There's a whole range of stuff that we do around kind of training and events and various publications, and we do a lot of international work as well. And as you would imagine, the question of how student engagement and academic development interface with each other has been hugely changed by the pandemic. You won't need me to tell you about the difficulties that has created in terms of the perceived reduction in engagement, the disruptions to learning, and there have been some positives, if positives isn't too insensitive a word, in terms of it's created some big conversations, as we alluded to in the plenary earlier this morning, about what learning is and what partnership is, and how students can be engaged in this new world that we're created. And I think also it's brought into sharp focus what we don't know about each other as well, staff and students, when we're not in the same room, when we're often just a black box on a screen, or we don't meet each other in person as part of the teaching process. And that's been captured in what Abbott, just in this very recent publication, described as loving ignorance. It's a fabulous paper on ignorance, and the role of ignorance in partnership, which I think is fabulous. On first read, I didn't like the phrase loving ignorance. I thought that was a bit too kind of contradictory and a bit too fluffy, but as I read the article more, I came to really love the phrase, because I think it sums up the idea that staff and students bring unique perspectives to a partnership. Each constituency knows something the other doesn't, and when we recognize that ignorance as something positive, it's great that I don't know about you. It's great that I don't know about you. That's not coming out of a position of kind of hostility or distance. It's coming out of an opportunity to learn. So, so a good conversation perhaps rests on that loving ignorance. To also frame my thoughts for today, I just want to share a few of my favorite ideas about how we understand partnership and what it means to us. And what it means particularly to staff. So I love the Gravett and Friends quote about it being transformative, developmental, and fun. Because yes, things are stressful and difficult, and we all know that with the reasons for the strikes this week about the stresses that there are in teaching. But it can be fun, and obviously you'll all know that educational development and partnership can be transformative and developmental as well. And Dollinger and Mercer Mapstone, writing from an Australian perspective, talk about those liminal spaces, and it can be uncomfortable, I think, for power dynamics to be disrupted, especially when we're the beneficiaries of those power dynamics, or at least we're used to them, or we tolerate them. And actually that can help create that loving ignorance, perhaps, if we do accept that if we move into a space, a physical or virtual or kind of emotional or mental space, that, not necessarily anyone is in charge when staff and students get together. And I'm being very big-headed and sharing one of my own articles about the different frameworks that we can use to interpret partnership and explore the different roles of students. But of course, the reason we're here for this workshop is to talk about the staff role in partnership. What can staff do to promote partnership, and what can they do to support student engagement? And that's the reason for the existence of the toolkit that Sparks created in May of this year, May or June, we published it. And what I'm going to do is post a link into the chat, which includes the resource. And I'm going to do three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the toolkit and just explain a little bit about it. And then secondly, I hope this is the majority of our time, we're going to do some activities from it. And this is where you come in, because I want you to choose which part of the toolkit we look at. So my aim is to keep boring you until no later than 12, so that we have a good 40, 35 minutes to play around with things as you wish. And then we'll conclude by looking at what you can do about things. So you can find the resource by clicking the link in the chat box. If you also go to the Sparks website and go to the supporting institutions dropdown, you'll find the staff development sort of heading within there, and that will link to the toolkit. And what you'll see when you get there is basically that the toolkit exists in a number of chapters, which I will explain, and there is also a user guide, which you should probably read first. So if you don't want to pay 100% attention to me, what you might like to do is download that user guide and be skimming that before we get to the hard work where you have to choose a topic. So fundamentally, the aims of the toolkit are twofold, and they're shaped partly by the pandemic and partly by just our general desire to update some of our staff development materials and just the general need to have some kind of interface between staff development and student engagement. So the aims, firstly, are to think about the student role in self-evaluation and quality enhancement of the learning experience. So how do students shape and enhance their own learning? And what does that mean for staff, I suppose, as well? And secondly, to work in partnership to develop some materials that are appropriate for you. So this isn't a resource that contains stuff that you can just download and deliver as is. They need to be contextualized, they need to be chopped and changed and turned into something that's relevant for the subject areas you work in, for the institution you work in, for the particular priorities that you're facing. And just to emphasize the beginning of point 2 there, to work in partnership, a lot of these materials envisage that you will create events or resources or processes or development opportunities where staff and students are in the room, are in the space together, so to create that mutual learning. Although, as I will explain, sometimes it might be best that it is just a staff-only process. So let me just quickly run through the chapters of the toolkit, and in a couple of minutes, you're going to choose one, possibly two, of these to do. We'll see how the timing goes. It'd be nice to spend 15 minutes on one of these and then see if we've got time for a second one. So first of all, a kind of general introductory one about understanding the student learning experience. What are the elements of it, what's in it, and how might staff use that? That might be quite useful for someone new to teaching, for example, or someone who's come in from an industry perspective. The second one is all about assessment. The third one is all about data and surveys. The third one, the fourth one, I don't know why we didn't call the fourth one annual monitoring, because that's really what it's getting at, and we phrased it in a different way. And then fifth and sixth are slightly more structural, because they're looking at representative systems, the course rep role and the role of the Students' Association or Students' Union, and how staff might kind of generate their understandings of that. So have a think about those 6 chapters, and in a minute or two, I'm going to ask you to vote for which one we look at first. But before I do that, I'd like to just share some of our thoughts about how the toolkit might be useful. And there are these, 11 dozen or so ideas of the kind of spaces and contexts in which these materials might be useful, and in which educational developers may be keen to kind of use them. And I'm not going to run through them all individually. I think they're all self-explanatory, but they are largely a mix of spaces, as I say, that might be staff only or staff and students together. Some of them might be about creating new spaces, and some of them are capitalizing on existing forums that you have. Some of them will be very informal. Some of them will be more formal, so looking at things like TQFE and PG CAP and other qualifications, how might you impact on the content of those? Some of them will be online, some of them will be synchronous or asynchronous, so on and so forth. And of course, some of them may relate to inducting new staff as well. So you might find that some of these resources are helpful for messages for staff who are new to the institution or new to teaching in general. So with that in mind, would you like to cast a vote? So have a look at these. So what's our time? 12:15. So let me confidently predict we could get through 2 of them. So why not put a number in the chat box and we'll see which one is the winner, which heading kind of is most relevant to the work that you're doing, and which one is most relevant to the things that are on your desk. Oh, it's a runaway victory for 2, 5 or 6. Yeah, fair enough. Oh, okay, right. What we're going to do, so Isaac, let's try and talk about this first one till 12:30, and then we'll vote again, excluding number 2. How about that? And so have a think about what your second preference might be. So let me stop sharing here. What you might do, remember that link I posted in the chat box? What you might like to do is download the notes. So I'm going to share the presentation. You'll see against each of the 6 items, there is a presentation and some notes. Maybe download the notes just for background. And what I will do is share the presentation for workshop 2. Where is it? There we are. So what I'll do is run through the basics of the slides, introduce the exercises, think about why you, how and why you might use it and how and why you might adapt it. Before I do, does anybody want to shout out and explain why they chose number 2? It was obviously an overwhelming priority. So what are the drivers that I ought to be responding to in the next 15 minutes? Just rearranging all my boxes again. Making sure everything's all in the right place. Yeah, okay, so what we have for each of the tools is basically a slide pack that you can muck about with and use to your heart's content. Hello, Helen, and welcome to you. What you have missed, Helen, is me wittering on about the background to the toolkit that we have, and I will post the link again to it. And people have chosen to have a look at one of the elements of it which relates to assessment. So there's the link where you can find the resource we're talking about now. So yeah, so what each one has, as I explained, there is the notes, and then there's a slide pack that you can muck about with. And you'll see in the slide pack there are some instructions about things to think about before you go through the event. In the notes rather, some things to think about before you, as you're planning an event around this topic, or event or a process or a briefing or whatever, and also some suggested reading and things like that. So this is the core slides. So if you use these, obviously you'll muck about with them, you'll improve them, you'll enhance them, and these are very much just a kind of a suggestion, a starting point. And what we've got is the idea, starting out with the idea that it might be a discussion workshop, staff and students getting together to discuss assessment and what works well. And obviously you'll want to kind of develop some objectives here. So what will be the objectives, and where might you be using it? So is this about, as James said, are you purposefully and putting front and center the desire to challenge power dynamics? Is that the reason you want to run this workshop? Is it about reflecting on the pandemic experience of assessment? Is it about the fact that maybe you haven't quite got enough feedback from students about assessment that you'd like? Is it that staff just kind of assess in the way that they were taught to, or the way that they think they should, and haven't kind of revisited that in a while? So it's worth having a think of what you feel the objectives for such a session might be. And then the next slide talks about the outline of usual assessment methods. So if you're going to do a workshop with staff and students, you probably want to either present or brainstorm the different assessment methods that you have. So why don't we do that in the chat box? Why not pile in all the assessment methods that you have and use? that you're aware of within your institutions? There's probably loads. Okay, so that first activity could be a useful kind of starting point, a good icebreaker. And then what could happen is the idea of proposing an alternative assessment method. So asking people to think, well, actually, now this could be linked to that first activity. You might look at what you've created from the brainstorm and say, well, actually, what would you like to try, or what would you like to experience as a student? It's worth prompting this conversation by saying, well, actually, you know, how do you best link to the learning objectives? You know, outside kind of traditional things like exams, how can you demonstrate your knowledge? And I'm loving all the ideas, you know, blogs and what have you. Great way of summing it up. Thank you, James. Yes, peer critique is valuable. Peer assessment is contentious. That could be a wonderful, you could bung that on a slide actually, James, and just say, discuss. Or even just put the word peer assessment on a slide and run away and see what happens. But yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, okay, Pam, good point. Yes, it could work where, you know, staff are already, where your students are already used to assessment, for example. Yes, good point. So yeah, so interrogate the list that you've come up with and explore where the diversity happens. So do you use different methods for different levels, different subjects? Do you ever offer choice? That kind of thing. What's the impact on facilities? So if it's, you know, if it's a pitch to, you know, your kind of local newspaper editor or whatever, does that need to be in person, Dragon Den style, or does it need to be, do you need access to labs to do practical exercises, and what does that mean for COVID regulations and COVID safe practice and that kind of thing? Then you can start kind of interrogating these a bit further, and here are some suggested questions to play around with. So are there any parts of the proposed alternative assessment methods that would work well for you? Which aspects are the most suitable and why? So let's imagine that we want to get away from an exam and someone suggests doing a blog or something more dialogic, or what else have we got? Yeah, making a poster or something. So a first question for people to talk about would be, yeah, what would work well for you in terms of this method? You know, does it appeal to people who are, you know, very good at speaking and presenting, but not very good at writing, for instance? And, you know, how does that be a fair comparison? So in fact, why not take part in that exercise? Pitch something from the list that somebody else has posted in the comments, and have a think about what, you know, why that might work for you, for the staff you work with, for, you know, maybe your original subject expertise before you got into academic development, that kind of thing. And just have a think. You know, post comments if you like, or bung your mic on and interrupt me if you wish. But have a think, you know, try and pick one and play around with it and imagine what staff might say. Is there a department or subject area where you're trying to do most work on assessment, where you think actually that, yeah, that department particularly could do with some gentle nudging on alternative assessment criteria? So is there one that you might be able to pluck from the list to sell a little bit? Yeah, turning a dissertation into an exhibition, that's going to be very good. It's a different way of communicating your findings and a different way of communicating the work you've created. It might be better for public engagement. It might draw more people in. It will test your ability to kind of, it's a bit like a Viva, but you don't quite know where the questions are coming from, isn't it? So yeah, it could test your reaction to unprompted or unexpected questions. So yeah, that's a good point. The second question to ask yourselves, are there any part of this assessment method that might not work? So, you know, are you seeing something? Well, James has made a very good point about the potential contentiousness of peer assessment. So there's one example of a potential disadvantage to a tool. So yes, is there something that wouldn't work? And which aspects of it might be least suitable? So you could imagine maybe doing this exercise individually. You could set this people into groups. You know, if you have people in a room, physical or virtual, you might want to arrange, you know, a good mix of staff and students, or arrange people by subject area, or perhaps mix them up to get the sparks flying between subject areas. Yes, okay, good point. Accrediting bodies are can be a challenge in terms of the freedom you have, or at least the freedom you have at the subject level, at the delivery level. You of course have the freedom to change it when you get, you work with the PSRB at the national level. Yeah, I agree with you, Helen. I think some people say, well, we can't do that because of the PSRB, but actually all that does is tell you that that's where the conversation should be happening. And I'm fascinated by how we can gather students at a national level by subject area to work with their PSRB on the future of the subject, particularly when we've seen lots of changes on it. So yeah, I mean, PSRBs of course have a role, and some people will use the SQA in Scotland who provide a lot of the module descriptors and say, well, we can't do that because it's, it's in the module descriptor, and that's perhaps taking liberties a bit. So draw the PSRB into the conversation. Actually, maybe they love these ideas and maybe they're just waiting for feedback from academics and students to change that thing that they've not changed for a while. Okay. And another question to pose on the reflections are, what might the constraints be on you achieving with this potential new method of assessment, and what are you facing that might prevent you from performing well? So yeah, these might be COVID regulations, these might be industry buy-in, these might be, again, kind of regulatory issues coming from PSRBs or academic registrars or whoever else. So yeah. Okay, and then obviously this kind of a subset of that it relates to the kind of the learning objectives. So which of the learning objectives could be assessed through different types of exams? And somebody did mention open book, I think, in the chat. I forget who. And then 3B, beyond exams, and what other ways can they demonstrate their knowledge and skills? And can this help us design any alternative methods? I think we're touching on what we've already discussed, so forgive me for racing through it slightly. Is it necessary for all students to be assessed in the same way? Obviously, it will vary across subjects. Is it possible for it to vary within subjects, especially if it's kind of project-based? You've got 2 weeks, you could come up with a presentation or a blog post or a poster or something. Where are you going to be allowed to have that flexibility if it all comes down to the same ability to assess? And what are people's thoughts on that? How do you how might you play to people's different kind of skill sets or capabilities or whatever? Let's move on. So one of the other subsets in terms of helping you to review a proposed tool, what's the impact on practical skills and practical spaces? How much can you do at home? So you could imagine, photography might be quite easy to do at home, but dealing with hazardous chemicals, probably less advisable. So have a think about that, and where might that work? And of course, it might be very easy to say, oh, well, you can just write that essay at home, but some of your students might, be living in a bedsit or, juggling kids and not have any peace and quiet to do anything. So have a think about, and actually getting away to the library or doing something else is probably a bit of a liberation. So are there kind of social justice issues as well in terms of people's ability to do this? And then finally, yeah, you've mentioned you've kind of external requirements, the SQA in Scotland and other accreditors, the PSRBs. Again, how can you not use any of these people as an excuse not to do something, but merely use them as an indicator of where the conversation lies? And admittedly, that's a difficult conversation, getting together all your views across the country within a subject area and passing that on to the PSRB. That's kind of beyond the might of most lecturers, but still it's important to signpost to that and raise that through national, industrial and subject forums where you're able. So that is a set of questions that you can use to prompt discussion and reflection. That's the end of that particular workshop. So I'm happy to stop for reflections briefly. I will reflect generally at the end of the workshop, but if we can take a couple of minutes, just, how was that? Are those useful questions? Could you imagine using them? Was I teaching my granny to suck eggs there? What do people think? Right. Are you all now seeing my slides again? So we've got 25-ish minutes left. So ignoring number 2, which would you vote for now to spend another 10 minutes on? Okay, it's an early lead for 1. Oh, 4's catching up. This is exciting. One stretching ahead again. I feel like a racing commentator. Okay, right. I think that's okay. 1 is beyond capture now. So let's have a look at number 1. So I have to stop sharing that and close that presentation. Open up my folder and find the workshop template for number 1. So what you might want to do, again, going back to the website, the web page where the resource was, I've just posted again, download the notes for it, and I will share the slides. So number 1, understanding the student learning experience. So as I say, this might have value with people new to teaching. It's probably, well, you tell me, actually, it's probably got value for all staff as well, regardless of their experience. So what I'm going to do is run through these slides and get all my windows in the right place so I can see everything properly. So yeah, understanding the student learning experience. Again, this is an editable slide pack that you can muck about with and do with as you wish. At the core of this presentation, of this workshop, is this diagram that we use in Sparks that breaks down this often amorphous idea of the student learning experience into something with some manageable bite-sized chunks. That, you know, it's very easy, for example, for to ask students, how's your learning going? How's everything going? And getting lots of kind of thoughts about, well, kind of, it's okay, it's fine, everything's good, I like it, or, my bus was late this morning, or I don't like the cafeteria, that kind of thing. So how can you focus questions onto the specific areas that you're looking at? So we use this workshop in our class rep training to help class reps ask better questions and more specific questions and perhaps more timely questions. And we also offer the questions to staff so that they can think about, firstly, the questions they can ask, but secondly, the expectations that they can have of the answers. So actually, where are you most looking for particular examples, and where are you most looking for, for feedback at particular times? Under the each of these headings, there's a set of questions that we have that you can use, and I'm just posting that in the chat box as well. A dozen or so questions under each version, and we also produced a COVID-19 specific set of questions that you can produce as well. That link hasn't worked properly, so let me just try and do that a bit better. Right, no, that link isn't really working very well. So let me just open it and then I'll share it. So yeah, hopefully these headings are kind of self-explanatory in terms of what they mean, but it's worth running through them and explaining a little bit about how they might work. So first of all, curriculum, fairly obvious in terms of questions about the infrastructure, if you like, of the course, the scaffolding, things like the learning objectives and how you frame the course. And so there's various questions you can get staff and students together to talk about in terms of expectations versus reality, how things have adapted in terms of COVID-19, and the ability to choose modules, for example. And so so you can create these questions to generate feedback from students, and so you could use this with students to generate some answers that you then take to staff, or you could do it all at the same time with everyone in the same room. Looking at the second element of the learning experience is learning resources. So this is the stuff, the physical things that you might use, might also virtual things as well. And here are some various questions around them in terms of your access to technology, how they are useful and COVID safe within particular subject areas. Again, we were kind of talking earlier about labs and what have you in studios. The third one is the learning and teaching process. So what is it actually like going through that learning and teaching process? What kind of approaches are taken to learning the different methods of teaching? What did it look like as you transitioned pre-pandemic through the pandemic, out of the pandemic, in terms of more online elements, and how could that work better? How do you balance on and off screen? Are there things that are perhaps worse during the pandemic, that kind of thing? Then we've got assessment and feedback. So building on what we talked about just in your previous choice of activity, you'll all know what is included within that. You don't need me to tell you, but again, here's some questions slightly similar to what we asked earlier that you can get people to think about in terms of that student view. Then we have progress and achievement. So basically, how are you moving between modules, between levels? How are you transitioning well into higher education and possibly from undergrad to postgrad and into the world of work? So again, there's some questions there that allow you to reflect on what that has been like, particularly at a time of transition where, for example, we might still be recovering from people not having done all their assessments from previous years and having to rethink the number of people that can be doing things at the same time, that sort of thing. And then guidance and support in terms of how academically are you supported in terms of the advice that you get on kind of writing skills, essay skills, that kind of thing, and what's that been like during the pandemic. And then the final element of the SLE diagram is quality enhancement and assurance. So these are questions basically asking how do things improve, and how does your voice as a student help to improve things through surveys, through your use of course reps, through your informal discussions with staff. And again, there's some questions here to prompt discussion in terms of, did you have a chance particularly to comment on how things have changed during the pandemic? So what we have then, that's basically the set of questions that you can use as the first activity. And I'll just keep the full diagram up to remind you of the headings. And the idea here is that you'd use that data. And of course, you may be gathering that data anyway. Your student union particularly will be gathering data around that. But are you gathering it at a subject level? How much does the NSS tell you, for example? How much do your own course evaluation surveys and your own university-led surveys allow you to do that? So that's kind of activity A as outlined in the notes. Activity B is basically analysing that. So and this is the crucial bit for educational development, what the staff make of those responses, and how can they build on them, how can they use them, and how does that impact on their practice? And then the third exercise basically is about co-creating solutions. So what out of the information that students have come up with is viable, realistic? How can we use it well to encourage, to bring about particular change, and also then to be able to celebrate the fact that students have co-created that change as well? You might need to go back, you might need to reinterrogate the data. You might think there's the nugget of a good point in there, but actually we need more examples, we need more specificity, so you can get back to students or get back to class reps and say, tell us more. So you've got that. It's this exercise, basically, this element of the toolkit is probably one of the simpler ones, because it's that simple process of gathering together the data that may need to be generated or you might already have. Secondly, doing the analysis of it to sort and identify what might work, and then secondly to co-create those solutions. And you can use a series of work with staff to reflect on that. And this might be an exercise that might work well at faculty level or subject level. It might work well with particular course teams, rather than in a cross-subject area, but it may well work cross-subject, I don't know. So as I say, a relatively simple one, perhaps, in terms of the exercises compared to the first one that we looked at. So I'll pause there for thoughts. Hopefully still reading the notes that are against template 1. Happy to get feedback, thoughts, ideas. Hopefully you're seeing useful things to pick up on in the kind of suggested reading that comes within the notes as well. But let me pause for a drink and see what reaction or thought there is on the value of this tool and the conversations it might prompt for staff. Right, What I'm going to do is stop sharing that, and I will go back to my original slides for the very quick wrap up. So you've seen 2 exercises, and some of you may be squirreling away in to look at the other exercises as well, which you're very welcome to do. And you might be reading more about them through the user guidance. And so what I'm interested to do is just check with you as we come into our last 7 or 8 minutes. These reflective questions. So how useful did you find those exercises? I'm going to bet that you rather more enjoyed toolkit 3 than toolkit 1, judging by the number of questions that were generated. I might be being grossly unfair to you in saying that. Perhaps you were just loving it. I'm just sitting back and absorbing. Perhaps you're getting bored of me after an hour, who knows. Where could they be valuable? So we've talked a little bit about the kind of places in which you could use this, the audience that you might have, and think back to what I said at the beginning about the mix of staff and students, the mix of pre-existing and new spaces, the existence of formal and informal learning for staff, that kind of thing. How would you modify them for your context? I suspect the answer is going to be substantially. You know, it might be on a cosmetic level, it needs to be branded for your institution, but also you want to adjust it to the terminology, the priorities, you want to build on the context of the work you're already doing, your existing educational development programs, the priorities coming out through your various strategies, and the views that the students might have about that. Who would you need to work with to do this? There are some hints on the next slide. And what topics might be missing? So we've had this toolkit in place for under a year. It was just before the summer. What might be missing in that, and what could we cover more within that? One idea someone suggested a while ago, I think it's an excellent one, is something that for postgraduates, whether that is a separate toolkit or whether it's something that is more about the orientation of all the slides, I don't know. There's also not something, there's not a specific toolkit about equality and diversity issues, but again, I think that comes up with in all the other ones. So to what extent do we need something separate? So yeah, we're open to ideas on other chapters, and we will be reviewing this on roughly an annual basis. So some actions, first of all, read the materials. I'll post it one last time in the chat box, or in fact, you'll find it further up. So have a look at them, dive into them, and enjoy them, play around with them, see what you can get out of them. And secondly, you know, it's freely available on our website, so help yourself as much as you like. Have a chat with relevant people within management in terms of those big pictures of drawing in existing strategies. Speak to everyone else in the educational development team. Talk to your students' union and your students' association. And by the way, remember that chapter 6 is all about the students' union. So again, that might be a great way of raising staff awareness. And obviously staff within quality are going to be important for this too. And finally, you know, speak to us if we can help. We'd love to get feedback. If you use any of these materials, we'd love to get your feedback. Did it work? What did people make of them? What didn't work? How could we improve it and make it better? You know, if we can help, you know, offer you some tips on using them and some facilitation, or speak to other colleagues about that, then we'd be glad to do that. Just looking at some comments here. What happens after the workshops or the co-created suggestions for action? Well, exactly, yes. I think that comes up in terms of the notes, and what we would expect people to do is do some evaluation and assess the impact, as I hope they're assessing all their educational development work. But fundamentally, Helen, Sparks will not know that unless institutions tell us that they're doing it. So we would really value that feedback. Away days, thank you, Judith. You're suggesting that as a good way of using an away day, yes, because some of these questions can be quite big picture, they can be quite probing, can be quite difficult. You want to take your time over them. Annalie, thank you for coming. No worries, we're just at the end of the hour and I'm about to wrap up, really. I'll linger for any further chat that folk want, but here's some of the references I had at the beginning, and there's my contact details, which you'll find on our website. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate those of you who have to disappear, and it is lunchtime, but I will linger for the next few minutes for anyone that wants to chat more. Thank you all, everybody, for all your stimulating input and insight. It's been really helpful. Thank you all very much.